unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Wind in the Willows. The riverbank. The mole had been working very hard all the morning, spring cleaning his little home. First with brooms, then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and on chairs, with a brush and a pail of whitewash, till he had dust in his throat and eyes, and splashes of whitewash all over his black fur, and an aching back and weary arms. It was a small wonder, then, that he suddenly flung down his brush on the floor, said, "Bother!" and "Oh, blow!" and also "Hang spring cleaning!" and bolted out of the house without even waiting to put on his coat. Something above him was calling imperiously. So he scraped and scratched and scrabbled and scrooged and scraped, working busily with his little paws and muttering to himself, up we go, till at last, pop, his snout came out into the sunlight, and he found himself rolling in the warm grass of a great meadow. "This is fine," he said to himself. "This is better than whitewashing." The sunshine struck hot on his fur, and soft breezes caressed his heated brow. Jumping off all his four legs at once, he pursued his way across the meadow. "Hold up!" said an elderly rabbit at the gap. "Sixpence for the privilege of passing by the private road." He was bowled over in an instant by the impatient and contemptuous mole, who trotted along the side of the hedge, chaffing the other rabbits as they peeped hurriedly from their holes to see what the row was about. "Onion sauce! Onion sauce!" he remarked jeeringly, and was gone before they could think of a thoroughly satisfactory reply. Hither and thither through the meadows he rambled busily. He thought his happiness was complete when, as he meandered aimlessly along, suddenly he stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. This sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle, and leaving them with a laugh to fling itself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. The mole was bewitched, entranced, and fascinated. A dark hole in the bank opposite, just above the water's edge, caught his eye, and dreamily he fell to considering what a nice, snug dwelling-place it would make for an animal with a few wants, and fond of a bijou riverside residence, above flood level and remote from noise and dust. As he gazed, something bright and small seemed to twinkle down in the heart of it, vanished, then twinkled once more, like a tiny star. Then, as he looked, it winked at him, and a small face began gradually to grow up round it like a frame round a picture. A brown little face, with whiskers, small neat ears, and thick, silky hair. It was the water-rat. Then the two animals stood and regarded each other cautiously. "Hello, Mole," said the water-rat. "Hello, Rat," said the mole. "Would you like to come over?" inquired the rat presently. "Oh, it's all very well to talk," said the mole. The rat said nothing, then lightly stepped into a little boat which the mole had not observed. It was painted blue outside and white within, and was just the size for two animals, and the mole's whole heart went out to it at once, even though he did not yet fully understand its uses. The rat held up his forepaw as the mole stepped gingerly down. "Lean on that," he said. "Now then, step lively." And the mole, to his surprise and rapture, found himself actually seated in the stern of a real boat. "This has been a wonderful day," said he, as the rat shoved off and took to the sculls again. "Do you know, I've never been in a boat before, in all my life." "What?" cried the rat, open-mouthed. "Never been in a... You never... Well, What have you been doing, then?" "Is it so nice as all that?" asked the mole shyly. "Nice? It's the only thing," said the water-rat solemnly, as he leant forward for his stroke. "Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats." "Simply messing," he went on dreamily, "messing about in boats. Messing—" "Look ahead, Rat!" cried Mole suddenly. It was too late. The boat struck the bank full tilt. The dreamer, the joyous oarsman, lay on his back at the bottom of the boat, his heels in the air. "About in boats or with boats," the rat went on composedly, picking himself up with a pleasant laugh. "In or out of 'em, it doesn't matter. Nothing seems really to matter. That's the charm of it. Whether you get away, or whether you don't, whether you arrive at your destination, or whether you reach somewhere else, or whether you never get anywhere at all, you're always busy, and you never do anything in particular. Look here, if you've really nothing else on hand this morning, supposing we drop down the river together and have a long day of it." The mole waggled his toes from sheer happiness, spread his chest with a sigh of full contentment, and leaned back blissfully into the soft cushions. "What a day I'm having," he said. "Let us start at once." "Hold hard a minute, then," said the rat. He looped the painter through a ring in his landing stage, climbed up into his hole above, and, after a short interval, reappeared, staggering under a fat, wicker luncheon basket. "Shove that under your feet," he observed to the mole, as he passed it down into the boat. Then he untied the painter and took the sculls again. "What's inside it?" asked the mole, wriggling with curiosity. "There's cold chicken inside it," replied the rat, briefly. "Cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, pickled gherkins, salad, French roll, cress sandwiches, potted meat, ginger beer, lemonade, soda water—" "Oh, stop, stop!" cried the mole in ecstasies. "This is too much." "Do you really think so?" inquired the rat seriously. "It's only what I always take on these little excursions, and the other animals are always telling me that I'm a mean beast, and cut it very fine." "I like your clothes awfully, old chap," he remarked after some half an hour or so had passed. "I'm going to get a black velvet smoking suit myself some day, as soon as I can afford it." "I beg your pardon," said the mole, pulling himself together with an effort. "You must think me very rude, but all this is so new to me. So this is a river." "The river," corrected the rat. "And you really live by the river? What a jolly life!" "By it, and with it, and on it, and in it," said the rat. "It's brother and sister to me, and aunts and company and food and drink, and, naturally, washing. It's my world, and I don't want any other. What it hasn't got is not worth having, and what it doesn't know is not worth knowing. Lord, the times we've had together! Whether in winter or summer, spring or autumn, it's always got its fun and its excitement." "But isn't it a bit dull at times?" the mole ventured to ask. "Just you and the river, and no one else to pass a word with?" "No one else to... Well, I mustn't be hard on you," said the rat with forbearance. "You're new to it, and of course you don't know. The bank is so crowded nowadays that many people are moving away altogether. Oh, no, it isn't what it used to be at all. Otters, kingfishers, dabchicks, moorhens, all of them about all day long, and always wanting you to do something.
as if a fellow had no business of his own to attend to. What lies over there? Asked the mole, waving a paw towards a background of woodland that darkly framed the water meadows on one side of the river. That? Oh, that's just the wildwood, said the rat shortly. We don't go there very much, we river bankers. Aren't they very nice people in there? Said the mole, a trifle nervously. Well, replied the rat, let me see. The squirrels are all right, and the rabbits, some of 'em. But rabbits are a mixed lot. And then there's Badger, of course. He lives in the heart of it. Wouldn't live anywhere else, either, if you paid him to do it. Dear old Badger. Nobody interferes with him. They better not, he added significantly. Why, who should interfere with him? Asked the mole. Well, of course, there are others, explained the rat, in a hesitating sort of way. Weasels, and stoats, and foxes, and so on. They're all right in a way. I'm very good friends with them. Pass the time of day when we meet and all that. But they break out sometimes, there's no denying it, and then, well, you can't really trust them, and that's the fact. The mole knew well that it is quite against animal etiquette to dwell on possible trouble ahead, or even allude to it, so he dropped the subject. And beyond the wildwood again? He asked. Beyond the wildwood comes the wide world, said the rat, and that's something that doesn't matter either to you or me. I've never been there, and I'm never going, nor you either, if you've got any sense at all. Now then, here's our backwater at last, where we're going to lunch. It was so very beautiful that the mole could only hold up both forepaws and gasp, "Oh my! Oh my! Oh my!" The rat brought the boat alongside the bank, made it fast, helped the still awkward mole safely ashore, and swung out the luncheon basket. The mole begged as a favour to be allowed to unpack it all by himself. He took out all the mysterious packets one by one and arranged their contents in due order, still gasping, "Oh my! Oh my!" at each fresh revelation. When all was ready, the rat said, "Now pitch in, old fellow," and the mole was indeed very glad to obey, for he had started his spring cleaning at a very early hour this morning, and had not paused for bite or sup. "What are you looking at?" said the rat presently. "I am looking," said the mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see travelling along the surface of the water." "Bubbles? Ho, ho!" said the rat, and chirruped cheerily in an inviting sort of way. A broad, glistening muzzle showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter hauled himself out and shook water from his coat. "Greedy beggars," he observed, making for the provender. "Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "This was an impromptu affair," explained the rat. "By the way, my friend, Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the otter, and the two animals were friends forthwith. "Such a rumpus everywhere," continued the otter. "All the world seems out on the river today. I came up this backwater to try to get a moment's peace, and then stumbled upon you fellows. At least, I beg pardon, I don't exactly mean that, you know." There was a rustle behind them, proceeding from a hedge wherein last year's leaves still clung thick, and a stripy head with high shoulders behind it peered forth on them. "Come on, old Badger!" shouted the rat. The badger trotted forward a pace or two, then grunted, "Company," and turned his back and disappeared from view. "That's just the sort of fellow he is," observed the disappointed rat. "Simply hates society. Now we shan't see any more of him today. Well, tell who's out on the river." "Toad's out for one," replied the otter, "in his brand-new wager boat. New togs, new everything." The two animals looked at each other and laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat. "Then he tired of that and took to punting. Nothing would please him but to punt all day and every day, and a nice mess he made of it. Last year it was houseboating, and we all had to go and stay with him in his houseboat and pretend we liked it. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a houseboat. It's all the same, whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh.
Such a good fellow, too, remarked the Otter reflectively. But no stability, especially in a boat. From where they sat, they could get a glimpse of the main stream across the island that separated them. And just then a wager boat flashed into view. The rower, a short, stout figure, splashing badly and rolling a good deal, but working his hardest.
"He'll be out of that boat in a minute if he rolls like that," said the Rat.
Of course he will, chuckled the Otter. An errant mayfly swerved unsteadily athwart the current in the intoxicated fashion affected by young bloods of mayflies seeing life. A swell of water and a kloop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the Otter. The Mole looked down. The voice was still in his ears, but the turf whereon he had sprawled was clearly vacant. Not an otter to be seen, as far as the distant horizon.
"Well, well," said the Rat, "I suppose we ought to be moving. I wonder which of us had better pack the luncheon basket."
He did not speak as if he was frightfully eager for the treat.
"Oh, please let me,"
said the Mole, so of course the Rat let him. The afternoon sun was getting low as the Rat sculled gently homewards in a dreamy mood, murmuring poetry things over to himself, and not paying much attention to Mole. But the Mole was very full of lunch, and self-satisfaction, and pride, and already quite at home in a boat, so he thought, and was getting a bit restless besides. And presently he said, "Ratty, please, I want to row now." The Rat shook his head with a smile.
"Not yet, my young friend," he said. "Wait till you've had a few lessons. It's not so easy as it looks."
The Mole was quiet for a minute or two, but he began to feel more and more jealous of Rat, and his pride began to whisper that he could do it every bit as well. He jumped up and seized the sculls so suddenly that the Rat, who was gazing out over the water, was taken by surprise and fell backwards off his seat, while the triumphant Mole took his place and grabbed the sculls with entire confidence.
"Stop it, you silly ass!" cried the Rat from the bottom of the boat. "You can't do it! You'll have us over!"
The Mole flung his sculls back with a flourish and made a great dig at the water. He missed the surface altogether. His legs flew up above his head, and he found himself lying on top of the prostrate Rat. Greatly alarmed, he made a grab at the side of the boat, and the next moment, sploosh! Over went the boat, and he found himself struggling in the river. Oh, my! How cold the water was, and oh, how very wet it felt. How it sang in his ears as he went down, down, down. How bright and welcome the sun looked as he rose to the surface, coughing and spluttering. Then a firm paw gripped him by the back of his neck. It was the Rat. The Mole could feel him laughing, right down his arm and through his paw, and so into his, the Mole's, neck. The Rat got hold of a scull and shoved it under the Mole's arm. Then he did the same by the other side of him, and swimming behind, propelled the helpless animal to shore, hauled him out, and set him down on the bank. A squashy, pulpy lump of misery. When the Rat had rubbed him down a bit, and wrung some of the wet out of him, he said,
"Now then, old fellow, trot up and down the towing path as hard as you can, till you're warm and dry again, while I dive for the luncheon basket."
The Rat plunged into the water again, recovered the boat, righted her, and made her fast, fetched his floating property to shore by degrees, and finally dived successfully for the luncheon basket and struggled to land with it. The Mole, limp and dejected, took his seat in the stern of the boat, and, as they set off, he said, in a low voice, broken with emotion, "Ratty, my generous friend,
I am very sorry indeed for my foolish and ungrateful conduct. My heart quite fails me when I think how I might have lost that beautiful luncheon-basket. Indeed, I have been a complete ass, and I know it. Will you overlook it this once, and forgive me, and let things go on as before?"
"That's all right, bless you," responded the rat cheerily. "What's a little wet to a water rat? I'm more in the water than out of it most days. Don't think any more about it. And look here, I really think you had better come and stop with me for a little time. It's very plain and rough, you know. Not like Toad's house at all. You haven't seen that yet. Still, I can make you comfortable, and I'll teach you to row and to swim, and you'll soon be as handy in the water as any of us." The mole was so touched by his kind manner of speaking that he could find no voice to answer him. When they got home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlour, and planted the mole in an armchair in front of it, having fetched down a dressing-gown and slippers for him. Supper was a most cheerful meal, but very shortly afterwards a terribly sleepy mole had to be escorted upstairs by his considerate host to the best bedroom, where he soon laid his head on his pillow in great peace and contentment, knowing that his new-found friend, the river, was lapping the sill of his window. This day was only the first of many similar ones for the emancipated mole, each of them longer and fuller of interest as the ripening summer moved onward. He learnt to swim and to row, and entered into the joy of running water, and, with his ear to the reed stems, he caught, at intervals, something of what the wind went whispering so constantly among them. The Open Road.
"Ratty," said the mole suddenly one bright summer morning, "if you please, I want to ask you a favour. Will you take me to call on Mr. Toad?" The rat was sitting on the river-bank, singing a little song. He had just composed it himself. Since early morning he had been swimming in the river, in company with his friends the ducks. "Why, certainly," said the good-natured rat, jumping to his feet. "Get the boat out, and we'll paddle up there at once. It's never the wrong time to call on Toad. Early or late, he's always the same fellow, always good-tempered, always glad to see you, always sorry when you go." "He must be a very nice animal," observed the mole as he got into the boat. "He is indeed the best of animals," replied Rat. Rounding a bend in the river, they came in sight of a handsome, dignified old house of mellowed red brick, with well-kept lawns reaching down to the water's edge. "There's Toad Hall," said the rat, "and that creek on the left leads to his boat-house, where we'll leave the boat. Toad is rather rich, you know, and this is really one of the nicest houses in these parts, though we never admit as much to Toad." They disembarked and strolled across the gay, flower-decked lawns in search of Toad, whom they presently happened upon resting in a wicker garden chair, with a preoccupied expression of face and a large map spread out on his knees.
"Hooray!"
he cried, jumping up on seeing them.
"This is splendid! How kind of you!"
He went on, dancing round them. I was just going to send a boat down the river for you, Ratty, with strict orders that you were to be fetched up here at once, whatever you were doing. I want you badly, both of you. You don't know how lucky it is you're turning up just now." "Let's sit quiet a bit, Toady," said the Rat, throwing himself into an easy chair, while the Mole took another by the side of him. "Now look here," said Toad. "Let's be sensible. You are the very animals I wanted. You've got to help me. It's most important." "It's about your rowing, I suppose," said the Rat, with an innocent air. "You're getting on fairly well, though you splash a good bit still. With a great deal of patience and any quantity of coaching, you may—" "Oh, pooh, boating!" interrupted the Toad in great disgust. "Silly waste of time, that's what it is. No, I've discovered the real thing, the only genuine occupation for a lifetime. I propose to devote the remainder of mine to it. Come with me, dear Ratty, and your amiable friend also, if he will be so very good, just as far as the stable yard, and you shall see what you shall see." He led the way to the stable yard accordingly, the Rat following with a most mistrustful expression. And there, drawn out of the coach-house into the open, they saw a gypsy caravan, shining with newness, painted a canary yellow picked up with green, and red wheels. "There you are!" cried the Toad. "There's real life for you, embodied in that little cart. The open road, the dusty highway, the heath, the common, the hedgerows, the rolling downs, camps, villages, towns, cities, here today, up and off to someone else tomorrow. Travel, change, interest, excitement, the whole world before you, and a horizon that's always changing." The Mole was tremendously interested and excited, and followed Toad eagerly up the steps and into the interior of the caravan. The Rat only snorted and thrust his hands deep into his pockets, remaining where he was. It was indeed very compact and comfortable. Little sleeping bunks, a little table that folded up against the wall, a cooking stove, lockers, bookshelves, a birdcage with a bird in it, and pots, pans, jugs, and kettles of every size and variety. "All complete," said the Toad triumphantly, pulling open a locker. "You see, biscuits, potted lobster, sardines, everything you can possibly want. Soda water here, baccy there, letter paper, bacon, jam, cards, and dominoes. You'll find that nothing whatever has been forgotten when we make our start this afternoon." "I beg your pardon," said the Rat slowly, "but did I overhear you say something about we, and start, and this afternoon?" "Now, you dear good old Ratty," said Toad imploringly, "don't begin talking in that stiff and sniffy sort of way, because you know you've got to come. I can't possibly manage without you, so please consider it settled, and don't argue. It's the one thing I can't stand. You surely don't mean to stick to your dull, fusty old river all your life, and just live in a hole in a bank and boat? I want to show you the world. I'm going to make an animal of you, my boy." "I don't care," said the Rat doggedly. "I'm not coming, and that's flat. And I am going to stick to my old river, and live in a hole, and boat, as I've always done. And what's more, Mole's going to stick to me and do as I do. Aren't you, Mole?" "Of course I am," said the Mole loyally. "I'll always stick to you, Rat, and what you say is to be has got to be. All the same, it sounds as if it might have been, well, rather fun, you know," he added wistfully. The Rat saw what was passing in his mind and wavered. He hated disappointing people, and he was fond of Mole, and would do almost anything to oblige him. Toad was watching both of them closely. "Come along in and have some lunch," he said diplomatically, "and we'll talk it over. We needn't decide anything in a hurry, of course. I don't really care. I only want to give pleasure to you fellows. Live for others. That's my motto in life." During luncheon,
which was excellent, of course, as everything at Toad Hall always was, the Toad simply let himself go. He painted the prospects of the trip and the joys of the open life and the roadside in such glowing colours that the Mole could hardly sit in his chair for excitement. Somehow it soon seemed taken for granted by all three of them that the trip was a settled thing. When they were quite ready, Toad led his companions to the paddock and set them to capture the old grey horse, who, without having been consulted, and to his own extreme annoyance, had been told off by Toad for the dustiest job in this dusty expedition. He frankly preferred the paddock, and took a deal of catching. At last the horse was harnessed, and they set off. It was a golden afternoon. The smell of the dust they kicked was rich and satisfying. Out of thick orchards on either side of the road, birds called and whistled to them cheerily. Late in the evening, tired and happy and miles from home, they drew up on a remote common far from habitations, turned the horse loose to graze, and ate their simple supper, sitting on the grass by the side of the cart. At last they turned into their little bunks in the cart, and Toad, kicking out his legs, sleepily said, "Well, good night, you fellows." After so much open air and excitement, the Toad slept very soundly, and no amount of shaking could rouse him out of bed next morning. So the Mole and Rat turned to quietly and manfully. Rat saw to the horse and lit a fire, and Mole trudged off to the nearest village for milk and eggs. After breakfast, they had a pleasant ramble that day over grassy downs and along narrow by-lanes, and camped, as before, on a common. Only this time the two guests took care that Toad should do his fair share of work. They were strolling along the high road, the Mole by the horse's head, talking to him, since the horse had complained that he was being frightfully left out of it, and nobody considered him in the least, the Toad and the Water Rat walking behind the cart talking together, when, far behind them, they heard a faint, warning hum, like the drone of a distant bee. Glancing back, they saw a small cloud of dust with a dark centre of energy advancing on them at incredible speed, while from out of the dust a faint poop, poop wailed like an uneasy animal in pain. Hardly regarding it, they turned to resume their conversation, when, in an instant, as it seemed, the peaceful scene was changed, and with a blast of wind and a whirl of sound that made them jump for the nearest ditch, it was on them. The poop-poop rang with a brazen shout in their ears. They had a moment's glimpse of an interior of glittering plate glass and rich morocco, and the magnificent motor car, immense, breath-snatching, passionate, with its pilot tense and hugging his wheel, possessed all earth and air for the fraction of a second, flung an enveloping cloud of dust that blinded and enwrapped them utterly, and then dwindled to a speck in the far distance, changed back into a droning bee once more. The old grey horse, dreaming, as he plodded along of his quiet paddock, in a new raw situation such as this, simply abandoned himself to his natural emotions, rearing, plunging, backing steadily, in spite of all the Mole's efforts at his head and all the Mole's lively language directed at his better feelings. He drove the cart backwards towards a deep ditch at the other side of the road. It wavered an instant. Then there was a heart-rending crash, and the canary-coloured cart, their pride and their joy, lay on its side in the ditch, an irredeemable wreck. The Rat danced up and down in the road, simply transported with passion. "You villains!" he shouted, shaking both fists. "You scoundrels! You highwaymen! You road hogs! I'll have the law on you! I'll report you! I'll take you through all the courts!" Toad sat straight down in the middle of the dusty road, his legs stretched out before him, and stared fixedly in the direction of the disappearing motor car. He breathed short. His face wore a placid, satisfied expression, and at intervals he faintly murmured, "Poop, poop." The mole was busy trying to quiet the horse, which he succeeded in doing after a time. The rat came to help him, but their united efforts were not sufficient to right the cart. "Hi, Toad!" they cried. "Come and bear a hand, can't you?" The toad never answered a word, or budged from his seat in the road. So they went to see what was the matter with him. They found him in a sort of trance, a happy smile on his face, his eyes still fixed on the dusty wake of their destroyer. At intervals he was still heard to murmur, "Poop, poop." The rat shook him by the shoulder. "Are you coming to help us, Toad?" he demanded sternly. "Glorious, stirring sight," murmured Toad, never offering to move. "The poetry of motion. Here today, in next week tomorrow. Villages skipped, towns and cities jumped. Always somebody else's horizon. Oh, bliss, oh, poop, poop, oh, my, oh, my." "Oh, stop being an ass, Toad," cried the mole despairingly. "And to think I never knew," went on the toad in a dreamy monotone. "All those wasted years that lie behind me, I never knew, never even dreamt. Henceforth, what dust cloud shall spring up behind me as I speed on my reckless way? What carts I shall fling carelessly into the ditch in the wake of my magnificent onset? Horrid little carts, common carts, canary-coloured carts." "What are we going to do with him?" asked the mole of Water Rat. "Nothing at all," replied the rat firmly, "because there is really nothing to be done. You see, I know him from of old. He is now possessed. He has got a new craze, and it always takes him that way. He'll continue like that for days. Never mind about him. Let's go and see what there is to be done about the cart." A careful inspection showed them that even if they succeeded in righting it by themselves, the cart would travel no longer. "Come on," Rat said grimly to Mole. "It's 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town, and we shall just have to walk it." "But what about Toad?" asked the Mole anxiously as they set off together. "We can't leave him here, sitting in the middle of the road by himself, in the distracted state he's in." "Oh, bother Toad," said the rat savagely. "I've done with him." They had not proceeded very far on their way, however, when there was a pattering of feet behind them, and Toad caught them up, and thrust a paw inside the elbow of each of them, still breathing short and staring into vacancy. "Now look here, Toad," said the rat sharply. "As soon as we get to the town, you'll have to go straight to the police station and see if they know anything about that motor car and who it belongs to, and lodge a complaint against it. And then you'll have to go to a blacksmith's or a wheelwright's and arrange for the cart to be fetched and mended and put to rights. Meanwhile, the mole and I will go to an inn and find comfortable rooms where we can stay till the cart's ready, and till your nerves have recovered their shock." "Police station. Complaint," murmured Toad dreamily. "Me complain of that beautiful, that heavenly vision that has been vouchsafed me. Mend the cart! I've done with carts forever. I never want to see the cart or hear of it again." The rat turned from him in despair. "You see what it is," he said to the mole. "He's quite hopeless. When we get to the town, we'll go to the railway station. We may pick up a train there that'll get us back to Riverbank tonight." On reaching the town, they went straight to the station. Eventually, a slow train landed them at a station not very far from Toad Hall. They escorted Toad to his door, put him inside it, and instructed his housekeeper to put him to bed. Then they got out their boat from the boathouse, sculled down the river home, and at a very late hour sat down to supper in their own cosy riverside parlour, to the rat's great joy and contentment. The following evening, the mole, who had risen late and taken things very easy all day, was sitting on the bank fishing, when the rat, who had been looking up his friends and gossiping, came strolling along to find him. "Heard the news?" he said. "There's nothing else being talked about all along the riverbank. Toad went up to town by an early train this morning,
and he ordered a large and very expensive motor car. The Wild Wood. The Mole had long wanted to make the acquaintance of the Badger. He seemed, by all accounts, to be such an important personage. But whenever the Mole mentioned his wish to the Water Rat, he always found himself put off. "It's all right," the Rat would say. "Badger'll turn up some day or other, and then I'll introduce you. The best of fellows. But you must not only take as you find, but when you find him." "Couldn't you ask him here to dinner or something?" said the Mole. "He wouldn't come," replied the Rat simply. "Badger hates society." "Well then, supposing we go and call on him," suggested the Mole. "Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't like that at all," said the Rat. "He's so very shy. I've never even ventured to call on him at his own home myself, though I know him so well. He lives in the very middle of the wild wood." In the winter-time, the Rat slept a great deal, retiring early and rising late. During his short day, he sometimes scribbled poetry or did other small domestic jobs about the house. There was plenty to talk about on those short winter days when the animals found themselves around the fire. Still, the Mole had a good deal of spare time on his hands, and so one afternoon, when the Rat in his armchair before the blaze was alternately dozing and trying over rhymes that wouldn't fit, he formed the resolution to go out by himself and explore the wild wood, and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. It was a cold afternoon, with a steely sky overhead, when he slipped out of the warm parlour into the open air. The country lay bare and entirely leafless around him. It was pitiful in a way, and yet cheering, even exhilarating. He was glad that he liked the country undecorated, hard, and stripped of its finery. He pushed on towards the wild wood, which lay before him, low and threatening. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Twigs crackled under his feet, logs tripped him, but that was all fun and exciting. It led him on, and he penetrated to where the light was less, and trees crouched nearer and nearer, and holes made ugly mouths at him on either side. Everything was very still now. The dusk advanced on him steadily, and the light seemed to be draining away like flood water. Then the faces began. It was over his shoulder that he first thought he saw a face, a little evil wedge-shaped face, looking out at him from a hole. He quickened his pace, telling himself cheerfully not to begin imagining things, or there would be simply no end to it. Then, suddenly, as if it had been so all the time, every hole, far and near, seemed to possess its face, coming and going rapidly, all fixing on him glances of malice and hatred, all hard-eyed and evil and sharp. He swung off the path and plunged into the untrodden places of the wood. Then the pattering began. He thought it was only falling leaves at first, so slight and delicate was the sound of it. Then, as it grew, it took a regular rhythm, and he knew it for nothing else but the pat-pat-pat of little feet, still a very long way off. Was it in front or behind?
It grew and multiplied, till from every quarter, as he listened anxiously, it seemed to be closing in on him. As he stood still, a rabbit came running hard towards him. He waited, expecting it to slacken pace or to swerve from him into a different course. Instead, the animal almost brushed him as it dashed past. "Get out of this, you fool, get out!" the mole heard him mutter as he swung round a stump and disappeared down a friendly burrow. In panic, he began to run too, aimlessly. He ran up against things, he fell over things, he darted under things and dodged round things. At last, he took refuge in the dark, deep hollow of an old beech tree which offered shelter. Anyhow, he was too tired to run any further, and could only snuggle down into the dry leaves and hope he was safe for the time. And, as he lay there and listened to the whistlings and the patterings outside, he knew it at last in all its fullness, that dread thing which other dwellers in field and hedgerow had encountered here, that thing which the rat had vainly tried to shield him from, the terror of the wild wood. Meantime, the rat, warm and comfortable, dozed by his fireside. His paper of half-finished verses slipped from his knee. His head fell back, his mouth opened. Then a coal slipped, and he woke with a start. Remembering what he had been engaged upon, he reached down to the floor for his verses, and then looked round for the mole. But the mole was not there. He listened for a time. The house seemed very quiet. Then he called, "Moley!" several times, and receiving no answer, got up and went out into the hall. The mole's cap was missing from its accustomed peg. His goloshes, which always lay by the umbrella stand, were also gone. The rat left the house and carefully examined the muddy surface of the ground outside, hoping to find the mole's tracks. There they were, sure enough. The goloshes were new, just bought for winter, and the pimples on their soles were fresh and sharp. He could see the imprints of them in the mud, running along straight and purposeful, leading direct to the wild wood. The rat looked very grave. Then he re-entered the house, strapped a belt round his waist, shoved a brace of pistols into it, took up a stout cudgel that stood in a corner of the hall, and set off for the wild wood. It was already getting towards dusk when he reached the first fringe of trees and plunged without hesitation into the wood, looking anxiously on either side for any sign of his friend. Here and there, wicked little faces popped out of holes, but vanished immediately at the sight of the valorous animal, his pistols, and the great ugly cudgel in his grasp. He made his way manfully through the length of the wood to its furthest edge, calling out cheerfully, "Moley! Moley! Moley! Where are you? It's me, old rat!" He had patiently hunted through the wood for an hour or more, when at last, to his joy, he heard a little answering cry. Guiding himself by the sound, he made his way through the gathering darkness to the foot of an old beech tree, and out of a hole came a feeble voice saying, "Ratty, is that really you?" The rat crept into the hollow, and there he found the mole, exhausted and still trembling. "Oh, rat!" he cried. "I've been so frightened. You can't think." "Oh, I quite understand," said the rat soothingly. "You shouldn't really have gone and done it, Mole. I did my best to keep you from it. We riverbankers, we hardly ever come here by ourselves. Of course, if you were badger or otter, it would be quite another matter." "Surely the brave Mr. Toad wouldn't mind coming here by himself, would he?" inquired the mole. "Old Toad!" said the rat, laughing heartily. "He wouldn't show his face here alone, not for a whole hatful of golden guineas, Toad wouldn't." The mole was greatly cheered by the sound of the rat's careless laughter, as well as by the sight of his stick and his gleaming pistols. "Now then," said the rat presently, "we really must pull ourselves together and make a start for home while there's still a little light left. It will never do to spend the night here, you understand. Too cold, for one thing." "Dear Ratty," said the poor mole,
I'm dreadfully sorry, but I'm simply dead beat, and that's a solid fact. You must let me rest here a while longer and get my strength back, if I'm to get home at all."
"Oh, all right," said the good-natured rat.
"It's pretty nearly pitch dark now anyhow. There ought to be a bit of moon later."
The mole got well into the dry leaves and stretched himself out, and presently dropped off into sleep. Rat covered himself up too, as best he might for warmth, and lay patiently waiting with a pistol in his paw. When at last the mole woke up, the rat said,
"Now then, I'll just take a look outside and see if everything's quiet, and then we really must be off."
He went to the entrance of their retreat and put his head out. Then the mole heard him saying quietly to himself,
"Hallo, hallo, here is a go."
"What's up, Ratty?" asked the mole.
"Snow is up," replied the rat briefly. "Or rather down. It's snowing hard."
The mole came and crouched beside him, and, looking out, saw the wood that had been so dreadful to him in quite a changed aspect. A gleaming carpet of fairy was springing up everywhere, that looked too delicate to be trodden upon by rough feet.
"Well, well, it can't be helped," said the rat, after pondering. "We must make a start and take our chance, I suppose. The worst of it is, I don't exactly know where we are, and now this snow makes everything look so very different."
They set out bravely, and took the line that seemed most promising, holding on to each other and pretending with invincible cheerfulness that they recognized an old friend in every fresh tree that grimly and silently greeted them. An hour or two later, they had lost all count of time. They pulled up, dispirited, weary, and hopelessly at sea, and sat down on a fallen tree trunk to recover their breath and consider what was to be done. They were aching with fatigue.
"We can't sit here very long," said the rat. "The cold is too awful for anything, and the snow will soon be too deep for us to wade through. Look here," he went on. "This is what occurs to me. There's a sort of dell down there in front of us. We'll make our way down into that and try and find some sort of shelter out of the snow and the wind, and we'll have a good rest before we try again."
So once more they got onto their feet and struggled down into the dell, where they hunted about for a cave or some corner that was dry and a protection from the whirling snow. They were investigating one of the hummocky bits when suddenly the mole tripped up and fell forward on his face with a squeal.
"Oh, my leg!"
he cried.
"Oh, my poor shin!"
And he sat up on the snow and nursed his leg in both his front paws.
"Poor old mole," said the rat kindly. "You don't seem to be having much luck today, do you? Let's have a look at that leg." "Yes," he went on, going down on his knees to look, "you've cut your shin. Wait till I get at my handkerchief, and I'll tie it up for you." "I must have tripped over a hidden branch," said the mole miserably. "Oh, my, oh, my." "It's a very clean cut," said the rat. "That was never done by a branch or a stump. Looks as if it was made by a sharp edge of something in metal. Funny." "Well, never mind what done it," said the mole, forgetting his grammar in his pain. "It hurts just the same whatever done it."
But the rat had left him, and was busy scraping in the snow. He scratched and shovelled and explored, while the mole waited impatiently, remarking at intervals,
"Oh, come on, rat."
Suddenly the rat cried, "Hooray!" and then,
"Hooray, hooray, hooray, hooray!" "What have you found, Ratty?" asked the mole.
"Come and see," said the delighted rat. The mole hobbled up to the spot and had a good look.
"Well,"
he said,
"I see it right enough. Seen the same sort of thing before lots of times. Familiar object, I call it. A door-scraper." "But don't you see what it means, you dull-witted animal?" cried the rat impatiently. "Of course I see what it means," replied the mole. "It simply means that some very careless and forgetful person has left his door-scraper lying about in the middle of the wild wood, just where it's sure to trip everybody up. When I get home I shall go and complain about it to somebody or other, see if I don't." Oh dear, cried the rat. "Here, stop arguing and come and scrape.
and he set to work again and made the snow fly in all directions around him. After some further toil, his efforts were rewarded, and a very shabby doormat lay exposed to view.
"There, what did I tell you?" exclaimed the rat in great triumph. "Absolutely nothing whatever," replied the mole. "Well now," he went on, "you seem to have found another piece of domestic litter done for and thrown away. Can we eat a doormat, or sleep under a doormat, or sit on a doormat and sledge home over the snow on it, you exasperating rodent?" "Do you mean to say," cried the excited rat, "that this doormat doesn't tell you anything?" "Really, rat," said the mole quite pettishly, "I think we've had enough of this folly. Whoever heard of a doormat telling anyone anything?" "Now look here, you thick-headed beast," replied the rat, really angry. "Not another word, but scrape and dig and hunt round if you want to sleep dry and warm tonight, for it's our last chance."
The rat attacked a snowbank beside them, and the mole scraped busily too, more to oblige the rat than for any other reason. Some 10 minutes' hard work, and the point of the rat's cudgel struck something that sounded hollow. He worked till he could get a paw through and feel. Then he called the mole to come and help him. Hard at it went the two animals. At last the result of their labours stood full in view of the astonished and hitherto incredulous mole. In the side of what had seemed to be a snowbank stood a solid-looking little door, painted a dark green. An iron bell-pull hung by the side, and below it, on a small brass plate, neatly engraved in square capital letters, they could read by the aid of moonlight, "Mr. Badger." The mole fell backwards on the snow from sheer surprise and delight.
"Rat," he cried in penitence, "you're a wonder, a real wonder, that's what you are. I fell and cut my shin, and you looked at the cut, and at once your majestic mind said to itself, 'Door scraper!' You're so clever, I believe you could find anything you liked. 'No,' says you, 'that door exists as plain as if I saw it. There's nothing else remains to be done but to find it. You ought to go where you'll be properly appreciated. You're simply wasted here among us fellows. If only I had your head, Ratty."
"Yes, but you haven't," interrupted the rat rather unkindly. "I suppose you're going to sit on the snow all night and talk. Get up at once and hang on to that bell-pull and ring hard as you can." While the rat attacked the door with his stick, the mole sprang up at the bell-pull, clutched it, and swung there. And from quite a long way off they could hear a deep-toned bell respond. Mr. Badger. They waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last they heard the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door from the inside. There was the noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes.
"Now, the very next time this happens,"
said a gruff and suspicious voice,
"I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up!"
"Oh, Badger," cried the rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow."
"What, Ratty, my dear little man?"
exclaimed the Badger.
in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you at once. Why, you must be perished."
The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The badger, who wore a long dressing gown and whose slippers were very down at heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw, and had probably been on his way to bed when their summons sounded. He looked kindly down on them.
"This is not the sort of night for animals to be out. I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything."
He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the light, and at once they found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large fire-lit kitchen. The floor was well-worn red brick, and on the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs, a couple of high-backed settles facing each other on either side of the fire. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards. At one end of it was spread the remains of the badger's plain but ample supper. From the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. It seemed a place where 2 or 3 friends of simple tastes could sit about as they pleased, and eat and smoke and talk in comfort and contentment. The ruddy brick floor smiled up at the smoky ceiling. The oaken settles, shiny with long wear, exchanged cheerful glances with each other. Plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf, and the merry firelight flickered and played over everything without distinction. The kindly badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched them dressing-gowns and slippers, and himself bathed the mole's shin with warm water, and mended the cut with sticking plaster, till the whole thing was just as good as new. It seemed to the storm-driven animals, now in safe anchorage, that the cold and trackless wild wood just left outside was miles and miles away, and all that they had suffered in it a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the badger summoned them to the table, where he had been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread for them, really it seemed only a question of what they should attack first. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table, or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had got an idea that these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything, and never said, "I told you so," or "just as I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so-and-so, or ought not to have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late. The badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the rat gravely. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest follows." "How many has he had?" inquired the badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the rat. "Oh, well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. "He's been in hospital 3 times, put in the mole. "And as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of. Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something?" The badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now, look here," he said at last, rather severely.
Of course, you know, I can't do anything now."
His two friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy. Some actually sleep.
"Very well, then," continued the Badger. "But when once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety, wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, you know—"
Both animals nodded gravely. They knew.
"Well, then," went on the Badger, "we, that is, you and me, and our friend the Mole here, we'll take Toad seriously in hand. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. We'll— You're asleep, Rat."
"Oh, not me," said the Rat, waking up with a jerk. "He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper,"
said the Mole, laughing.
"Well, it's time we were all in bed,"
said the Badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks.
"Come along, you two, and I'll show you your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please."
He conducted the two animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. 2 little white beds looked soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender, and the Mole and the Water Rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. In accordance with the kindly Badger's injunctions, the 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late the next morning, and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen, and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table, eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls.
"Where's Mr. Badger?"
inquired the Mole, as he warmed the coffee-pot before the fire.
"The master's gone into his study, sir,"
replied the hedgehog.
"and he said as how he was going to be particularly busy this morning, and on no account was he to be disturbed."
This explanation, of course, was thoroughly understood by everyone present. The animals well knew that Badger, having eaten a hearty breakfast, had retired to his study and settled himself in an armchair with his legs up on another, and a red cotton handkerchief over his face, and was being busy in the usual way at this time of the year. The front door bell clanged loudly, and the Rat sent Billy, the smaller hedgehog, to see who it might be. There was a sound of much stamping in the hall, and presently Billy returned in front of the Otter, who threw himself on the Rat with an embrace and a shout of affectionate greeting.
"Oh, get off!"
spluttered the Rat with his mouth full.
"Thought I might find you here all right," said the Otter cheerfully. "They were all in a great state of alarm along Riverbank when I arrived this morning. Rat never been home all night, nor Mole either. Something dreadful must have happened, they said, and the snow had covered up all your tracks, of course. But I knew that when people were in any fix, they mostly went to Badger. So I came straight here, through the wild wood and the snow. My, it was fine coming through the snow. I met no sensible being to ask the news of. About halfway across I came on a rabbit, sitting on a stump, cleaning his silly face with his paws. He was a pretty scared animal. At last I managed to extract from him that Mole had been seen in the wild wood last night by one of them."
"Weren't you at all nervous?"
asked the Mole, some of yesterday's terror coming back to him at the mention of the wild wood.
"Nervous?
The Otter showed a gleaming set of strong white teeth as he laughed.
I'd give 'em nerves if any of them tried anything on me. Here, Mole, fry me some slices of ham like the good chap you are. I'm frightfully hungry, and I've got any amount to say to Ratty here. Haven't seen him for an age."
A plate of fried ham had just been cleared and sent back for more when the Badger entered, yawning and rubbing his eyes, and greeted them all in his quiet, simple way, with kind inquiries for everyone.
"It must be getting on for luncheon time,"
he remarked to the Otter.
"Better stop and have it with us. You must be hungry this cold morning."
Presently they all sat down to luncheon together. The Mole found himself placed next to Mr. Badger.
"Once well underground," Mole said, "you know exactly where you are. Nothing can happen to you, and nothing can get at you. When you want to, up you go, and there the things are, waiting for you."
The Badger simply beamed on him.
"That's exactly what I say. he replied. "There's no security, or peace, or tranquillity except underground. And above all, no weather. Look at Rat now. A couple of feet of flood water and he's got to move into hired lodgings. Uncomfortable, inconveniently situated, and horribly expensive. Take Toad. I say nothing against Toad Hall, quite the best house in these parts, as a house. But supposing a fire breaks out, where's Toad? Supposing tiles are blown off, or walls sink, or crack, or windows get broken, where's Toad? Supposing the rooms are draughty, I hate a draught myself, where's Toad? No, up and out of doors is good enough to roam about and get one's living in, but underground to come back to at last, oh, that's my idea of home."
After luncheon, Badger lighted a lantern and bade the Mole follow him, and spent a happy hour showing off his home. When they got back to the kitchen again, they found the Rat walking up and down, very restless.
Come along, Mole, he said anxiously, as soon as he caught sight of them. "We must get off before it's daylight. Don't want to spend another night in the wild wood again."
"It'll be all right, my fine fellow," said the Otter. "I'm coming along with you, and I know every path blindfold. And if there's a head that needs to be punched, you can confidently rely upon me to punch it."
The Rat was nevertheless still anxious to be off and attend to his river, so the Badger, taking up his lantern again, led the way along a damp and airless tunnel. At last, daylight began to show itself confusedly through tangled growth overhanging the mouth of the passage, and the Badger, bidding them a hasty good-bye, pushed them hurriedly through the opening, made everything look as natural as possible again, with creepers, brushwood, and dead leaves, and retreated. They found themselves standing on the very edge of the wild wood. The Otter, knowing all the paths, took charge of the party, and they trailed out on a bee-line for a distant stile. Pausing there a moment and looking back, they saw the whole mass of the wild wood, dense, menacing, compact, grimly set in vast surroundings. Simultaneously they turned and made swiftly for home. Mr. Toad. It was a bright morning in the early part of summer. The Mole and the Water Rat had been up since dawn, busy on matters connected with boats and the opening up of the boating season, painting and varnishing, mending paddles, repairing cushions, and so on, and were finishing breakfast in their little parlour when a heavy knock sounded at the door.
"Bother," said the Rat. "See who it is, Mole, like a good chap, since you've finished."
The Mole went to attend the summons, and the Rat heard him utter a cry of surprise. Then he flung the parlour door open and announced with much importance, "Mr. Badger." The Badger strode heavily into the room and stood looking at the two animals with an expression full of seriousness.
"The hour has come,"
said the Badger at last, with great solemnity.
What hour?"
asked the Rat uneasily, glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece.
"Whose hour, you should rather say,"
replied the Badger.
"Why, Toad's hour, the hour of Toad. I said I would take him in hand as soon as the winter was well over, and I'm going to take him in hand today."
"Toad's hour, of course," cried the Mole delightedly. "Hooray! I remember now. We'll teach him to be a sensible Toad."
"This very morning,"
continued the Badger, taking an armchair,
"as I learnt last night from a trustworthy source, another new and exceptionally powerful motor car will arrive at Toad Hall on approval or return. You two animals will accompany me instantly to Toad Hall, and the work of rescue shall be accomplished."
Right you are, cried the rat, starting up. We'll rescue the poor unhappy animal. We'll convert him. He'll be the most converted toad that ever was before we've done with him. They set off up the road on their mission of mercy. When they reached Toad Hall, they found a shiny new motor car standing in front of the house. As they neared the door, it was flung open, and Mr. Toad, arrayed in goggles, cap, gaiters, and enormous overcoat, came swaggering down the steps.
"Hello! Come on, you fellows!" he cried cheerfully. "You're just in time to come with me for a jolly... jolly." His hearty accents faltered and fell away as he noticed the stern look on the countenances of his silent friends, and his invitation remained unfinished. The Badger strode up the steps.
"Take him inside,"
he said sternly to his companions. Then he turned to the chauffeur in charge of the new motor car.
"I'm afraid you won't be wanted today. Mr. Toad has changed his mind. He will not require the car."
Then he followed the others inside and shut the door.
"Now then," he said to the Toad, "first of all, take those ridiculous things off."
"Shan't," replied Toad with great spirit. "I demand an instant explanation."
"Take them off him, then, you two," ordered the Badger.
A good deal of Toad's blustering spirit seemed to evaporate with the removal of his fine panoply. He giggled feebly and looked from one to the other appealingly, seeming not quite to understand the situation.
"You knew it must come to this sooner or later, Toad," the Badger explained severely. "You've disregarded all the warnings we've given you, and you're getting us animals a bad name in the district by your smashes and your rows with the police. Now, you're a good fellow in many respects, and I don't want to be too hard on you. I'll make one more effort to bring you to reason. You will come with me into the smoking room, and there you will hear some facts about yourself, and we'll see whether you come out of that room the same Toad that you went in."
He took Toad by the arm, led him into the smoking room, and closed the door behind them.
"That's no good," said the rat to Mole. "Talking to Toad'll never cure him. He'll say anything."
They made themselves comfortable in armchairs and waited patiently. Some 3/4 of an hour later the door opened and the Badger reappeared, solemnly leading by the paw a very limp and dejected Toad.
"Sit down there, Toad,"
said the Badger kindly.
"My friends, I am pleased to inform you that Toad has at last seen the errors of his ways. He is truly sorry for his misguided conduct in the past, and he has undertaken to give up motor cars entirely and forever. I have his solemn promise to that effect."
"That is very good news," said the Mole gravely.
"There's only one thing more to be done," continued the Badger. "Toad, I want you solemnly to repeat before your friends here what you fully admitted to me in the smoking room just now."
There was a long, long pause. Toad looked desperately this way and that. At last he spoke. "No," he said, a little sullenly, but stoutly. "I'm not sorry, and it wasn't folly at all. It was simply glorious."
"What?"
cried the Badger, greatly scandalized.
"You backsliding animal! Didn't you tell me just now, in there—"
"Oh, yes, yes," said Toad impatiently. "I'd have said anything in there. You're so eloquent, dear Badger, and you put all your points so frightfully well. You can do what you like with me in there, and you know it. But I've been searching my mind since, and I find that I'm not a bit sorry or repentant really, so it's no earthly good saying I am now, is it?"
"Then you don't promise," said the Badger, "never to touch a motor car again?"
"Certainly not," replied Toad emphatically. "On the contrary, I faithfully promise that the very first motor car I see, boop, boop, off I go in it."
"Told you so, didn't I?"
observed the rat to the Mole.
"Very well, then," said the Badger. "Since you won't yield to persuasion, we'll try what force can do. You've often asked us three to come and stay with you. Well, now we're going to. When we've converted you to our proper point of view, we may quit, but not before. Take him upstairs, you two, and lock him up in his bedroom, while we arrange matters between ourselves."
"It's for your own good, Toady, you know,"
said the rat kindly. as Toad, kicking and struggling, was hauled up the stairs and locked in his room. The three friends then arranged watches so that Toad would never be left unguarded for an instant. One fine morning, the rat, whose turn it was to go on duty, went upstairs to relieve Badger, whom he found fidgeting to be off and stretch his legs.
"Toad's still in bed," he told the rat. "Can't get much out of him. Now you look out. When Toad's quiet and submissive, then he's at his artfullest. There's sure to be something up. I know him. Well, now, I must be off."
"How are you today, old chap?" inquired the rat.
He had to wait some minutes for an answer. At last a feeble voice replied,
"Thank you so much, dear Ratty. So good of you to inquire."
Mole, the rat added incautiously,
"is going out for a run around with Badger. I'll do my best to amuse you. Now, jump up, there's a good fellow, and don't lie moping there on a fine morning like this."
"Dear, kind rat," murmured Toad, "how little you realize my condition, and how very far I am from jumping up now, if ever. But do not trouble about me. I hate being a burden to my friends, and I do not expect to be one much longer. Indeed, I almost hope not."
"Well, I hope not too," said the rat heartily. "And in weather like this, and the boating season just beginning, it's too bad of you, Toad. It isn't the trouble we mind, but you're making us miss such an awful lot."
"I'm afraid it is the trouble you mind, though," replied the Toad languidly. "I mustn't ask you to do anything further. I'm a nuisance, I know."
"You are indeed," said the rat. "But I tell you I'd take any trouble on earth for you, if only you'd be a sensible animal."
"If I thought that, Ratty," murmured Toad more feebly than ever, "then I would beg you, for the last time probably, to step round to the village as quickly as possible, even now it may be too late, and fetch the doctor."
"Why, what do you want a doctor for?" inquired the rat, coming closer and examining him.
"Surely you have noticed of late," murmured Toad. "But no, why should you? Noticing things is only a trouble. Tomorrow, indeed, you may be saying to yourself, 'Oh, if only I had noticed sooner! If only I had done something!'"
"Hey, look here, old man," said the rat, beginning to get rather alarmed. "Of course I'll fetch a doctor to you, if you really think you want him. But you can hardly be bad enough for that yet. Let's talk about something else."
"I fear, dear friend," said Toad with a sad smile, "that talk can do little in a case like this, or doctors either, for that matter. Still, one must grasp at the slightest straw."
Rat hurried from the room, not forgetting, however, to lock the door carefully behind him. Outside, he stopped to consider. The other two were far away, and he had no one to consult.
"It's best to be on the safe side," he said on reflection. "If there's nothing really the matter, the doctor will tell him he's an old ass and cheer him up. I'd better humour him and go."
He ran off to the village on his errand of mercy. The Toad, who had hopped lightly out of bed as soon as he heard the key turned in the lock, watched him eagerly from the window till he disappeared down the carriageway. Then, laughing heartily, he dressed as quickly as possible, filled his pockets with cash, which he took from a small drawer in the dressing-table, and next, knotting the sheets from his bed together and tying one end of the improvised rope round the central mullion of the handsome Tudor window which formed such a feature of his bedroom, he scrambled out, slid lightly to the ground, and, taking the opposite direction to the rat, marched off light-heartedly, whistling a merry tune. It was a gloomy luncheon for Rat when the Badger and the Mole at length returned, and he had to face them at the table with his pitiful and unconvincing story. Even the Mole, though he took his friend's side as far as possible, could not help saying, "You've been a bit of a duffer this time, Ratty. Toad, too, of all animals." Meanwhile, Toad was walking briskly along the high road some miles from home. He strode along, his head in the air, till he reached a little town where the sign of the Red Lion, swinging across the road halfway down the main street, reminded him that he was exceedingly hungry after his long walk. He marched into the inn, ordered the best luncheon that could be provided at so short a notice, and sat down to eat. He was about halfway through his meal when an only too familiar sound approaching down the street made him start and fall a-trembling all over. As the poop-poop drew nearer and nearer, and the car could be heard to turn into the inn yard and come to a stop, Toad had to hold on to the leg of the table to conceal his overmastering emotion. Presently the party entered the coffee-room, hungry, talkative, and gay. Toad listened eagerly. At last he could stand it no longer. He slipped out of the room quietly to the inn yard. "There cannot be any harm," he said to himself, "in my only just looking at it." The car stood in the middle of the yard, quite unattended. Toad walked slowly round it. "I wonder," he said to himself, "I wonder if this sort of car starts easily." Next moment, as if in a dream, he found himself somehow seated in the driver's seat. He pulled the lever and swung the car round the yard and out through the archway. He increased his pace, and as the car devoured the street and leapt forth on the high road through the open country, he was only conscious that he was Toad once more, Toad at his best and highest, Toad the terror, Toad the traffic queller. The clerk of the court scratched his nose with his pen. "Some people would consider," he observed, "that stealing the motor car was the worst offence. And so it is. But cheeking the police undoubtedly carries the severest penalty, and so it ought. Supposing you were to say 12 months for the theft, which is mild, and 3 years for the furious driving, which is lenient, and 15 years for the cheek, which was pretty bad sort of cheek, judging by what we've heard from the witness box. Those figures, if added together correctly, tot up to 19 years. "First rate," said the chairman of the bench of magistrates, looking at Toad, who stood cowering in the dock. "So you had better make it around 20 years and be on the safe side," concluded the clerk. "An excellent suggestion," said the chairman approvingly. "Prisoner, pull yourself together and try and stand up straight. It's going to be 20 years for you this time, and mind, if you appear before us again, upon any charge whatever, we shall have to deal with you very seriously." The Dungeon. Across the hollow-sounding drawbridge, below the spiky portcullis, under the frowning archway of the grim old castle, whose ancient towers soared high overhead, to the door of the grimmest dungeon that lay in the heart of the innermost keep, where an ancient jailer sat, fingering a bunch of mighty keys, there they brought the hapless Toad. The jailer laid his withered hand on the shoulder of the miserable Toad. The rusty key creaked in the lock, the great door clanged behind them, and Toad was a helpless prisoner in the remotest dungeon of the best-guarded keep of the stoutest castle in all the length and breadth of merry England. Now the jailer had a daughter, a pleasant wench and good-hearted, who assisted her father. She was particularly fond of animals. This kind-hearted girl, pitying the misery of Toad, said to her father one day, "Father, I can't bear to see that poor beast so unhappy and getting so thin. You let me have the managing of him." Her father replied that she could do what she liked with him. He was tired of Toad and his sulks and his airs. So that day she went on her errand of mercy. "Now cheer up, Toad," she said coaxingly, "and sit up and dry your eyes and be a sensible animal. And do try and eat a bit of dinner. See, I've brought you some of mine hot from the oven." It was bubble and squeak. Its fragrance filled the narrow cell. The penetrating smell of cabbage reached the nose of Toad as he lay prostrate on the floor, and gave him the idea that perhaps life was not such a blank and desperate thing as he had imagined. Toad sat up, dried his eyes, and soon began talking freely about himself and the house he lived in. When the girl said good night, Toad was very much the same sanguine, self-satisfied animal that he had been of old. He sang a little song or two, curled himself up in the straw, and had an excellent night's rest. They had many interesting talks together, and the jailer's daughter grew very sorry for Toad. One morning she was very thoughtful. "Toad," she said presently, "just listen, please. I have an aunt who is a washerwoman."
"There, there," said Toad graciously and affably. "Never mind. Think no more about it. I have several aunts who ought to be washerwomen."
"Do be quiet a minute, Toad," said the girl. "She does the washing for all the prisoners in this castle. Now, this is what occurs to me. You're very rich, and she's very poor. A few pounds wouldn't make any difference to you, and it would mean a lot to her. Now, I think if she were properly approached, you could come to some arrangement by which she would let you have her dress and bonnet, and you could escape from the castle as the official washerwoman. You're very alike in many respects, particularly the figure."
"Well, not," said the Toad in a huff. "I have a very elegant figure, for what I am."
"So has my aunt," replied the girl, "for what she is. You horrid, proud, ungrateful animal, when I'm sorry for you and trying to help you."
Yes, that's all right, thank you very much indeed," said the Toad hurriedly. "But look here, you wouldn't surely have Mr. Toad of Toad Hall going about the country disguised as a washerwoman?"
"Then you can stop here as a toad," replied the girl. Honest Toad was always ready to admit himself in the wrong.
"You are a good, kind, clever girl," he said, "and I am indeed proud and a stupid toad. Introduce me to your worthy aunt, and I have no doubt that the excellent lady and I will be able to arrange terms satisfactory to both parties."
Next evening the girl ushered her aunt into Toad's cell. In return for his cash, Toad received a cotton print gown, an apron, a shawl, and a rusty black bonnet. The only stipulation the old lady made being that she should be gagged and bound and dumped down in a corner. By this not very convincing artifice, she explained, she hoped to retain her situation, in spite of the suspicious appearance of things. He readily helped the jailer's daughter to make her aunt appear as much as possible the victim of circumstances over which she had no control. "Now it's your turn, Toad," said the girl. Shaking with laughter, she proceeded to hook and eye him into the cotton print gown, arranged the shawl with a professional fold, and tied the strings of the rusty bonnet under his chin. "You're the very image of her," she giggled. "Now good-bye, Toad, and good luck. Go straight down the way you came up, and if anyone says anything to you, you can chaff back a bit, of course. But remember, you're a widow woman, quite alone in the world, with a character to lose." Toad set forth cautiously on what seemed to be a most harebrained and hazardous undertaking. But he was soon agreeably surprised to find how easy everything was made for him. The washerwoman's squat figure, in its familiar cotton print, seemed a passport for every barred door and grim gateway. It seemed hours before he crossed the last courtyard, but at last he heard the wicket gate in the great outer door click behind him, felt the fresh air of the outer world upon his anxious brow, and knew that he was free. The engine. As Toad walked quickly away, his attention was caught by some red and green lights a little way off, and the sound of the puffing and snorting of engines and the banging of shunted trucks fell on his ear. "Aha!" he thought. "This is a piece of luck. A railway station is the thing I want most in the whole world at this moment." He made his way to the station accordingly, consulted a timetable, and found that a train, bound more or less in the direction of his home, was due to start in half an hour. So he went off to the booking office to buy his ticket. He gave the name of the station, and mechanically put his fingers in search of the necessary money where his waistcoat pocket should have been, but found not only no money, but no pocket to hold it, and no waistcoat to hold the pocket. To his horror he recollected that he had left both coat and waistcoat behind him in his cell. Baffled and full of despair, Toad wandered blindly down the platform where the train was standing, and tears trickled down each side of his nose.
"Hello, mother,"
said the engine-driver.
"What's the trouble?"
"Oh, sir,"
said Toad, crying afresh.
"I'm a poor washerwoman, and I've lost all my money, and I can't pay for a ticket, and I must get home tonight, whatever am I to do? I don't know, oh dear, oh dear."
"Oh, that's a bad business indeed," said the engine-driver. "Lost your money and can't get home, and got some kids too waiting for you, I dare say."
"Any amount of them,"
sobbed Toad.
"and they'll be hungry and quarrelling, oh dear, oh dear."
"Well, I'll tell you what I'll do," said the good engine-driver. "You're a washerwoman to your trade, says you, and I'm an engine-driver, and there's no denying it's terribly dirty work. Uses up a power of shirts, it does, till my missus is fair tired of washing 'em. If you'll wash a few shirts for me when you get home and send 'em along, I'll give you a ride on my engine. It's against the company's regulations, but we're not so very particular in these out-of-the-way parts."
The Toad's misery turned into rapture as he scrambled up into the cab of the engine. Of course, he had never washed a shirt in his life, and anyhow he wasn't going to begin. But he thought, "When I get safely home to Toad Hall and have money again, I will send the engine-driver enough to pay for quite a quantity of washing, and that will be the same thing, or better." The guard waved his welcome flag, the engine-driver whistled in cheerful response, and the train moved out of the station. They'd covered many and many a mile when Toad noticed that the engine-driver, with a puzzled expression on his face, was leaning over the side of the engine and listening hard. Then he saw him climb onto the coals and gaze out over the top of the train. Then he returned and said to Toad,
"Oh, it's very strange. We're the last train running in this direction tonight, yet I could be sworn that I heard another following us."
Toad at once became grave and depressed, and a dull pain in the lower part of his spine, communicating itself to his legs, made him want to sit down and try desperately not to think of all the possibilities. Presently the engine-driver called out,
"I can see it clearly now. It is an engine on our rails coming along at a great pace. It looks as if we were being pursued." "They're gaining on us fast,"
cried the engine-driver.
"And the engine is crowded with the queerest lot of people, all waving and all shouting the same thing. Stop! Stop! Stop!"
Then Toad fell to his knees, and raising his clasped paws in supplication, cried,
"Save me! Only save me, dear kind Mr. Engine-driver, and I will confess everything. I am not the simple washerwoman I seem to be. I am a Toad, the well-known and popular Mr. Toad, a landed proprietor. I have just escaped, by my great daring and cleverness, from a loathsome dungeon into which my enemies had flung me, and if those fellows on that engine recapture me, it will be chains and bread and water once more for poor, unhappy, innocent Toad."
The engine-driver looked down upon him very sternly, and said,
"Now tell the truth. What were you put in prison for?"
"It was nothing very much," said poor Toad. "I only borrowed a motor car while the owners were at lunch. They had no need of it at that time. I didn't mean to steal it, really. But people, especially magistrates, take such harsh views of thoughtless and high-spirited actions."
The engine-driver looked very grave and said,
"I fear that you have been indeed a wicked Toad, and by rights I ought to give you up to offended justice. But the sight of an animal in tears always makes me feel queer and soft-hearted. So cheer up, Toad. I'll do my best, and we may beat them yet."
They piled on more coals. The furnace roared, the sparks flew, the engine leapt and swung, but still their pursuers slowly gained. The engine-driver, with a sigh, wiped his brow and said,
"I'm afraid it's no good. You see, they are running light, and they have the better engine. There's just one thing left for us to do, and it's your only chance, so attend very carefully to what I tell you. A short way ahead of us is a long tunnel, and on the other side of that the line passes through a thick wood. Now, I will put on all the speed while we're running through the tunnel, but the other fellows will slow down a bit naturally for fear of an accident. When we are through, I will shut off steam and put on brakes as hard as I can, and the moment it's safe to do so, you must jump and hide in the wood before they get through the tunnel and see you. Then I will go full speed ahead again, and they can chase me. Now mind, and be ready to jump when I tell you."
They piled on more coals, and the train shot into the tunnel, and the engine rushed and roared and rattled, and shot out at the other end into fresh air and the peaceful moonlight. They saw the wood lying dark and helpful upon either side of the line. The driver shut off steam and put on brakes. The Toad got down on the step, and as the train slowed down to almost a walking pace, he heard the driver call out,
"Now jump!"
Toad jumped, rolled down a short embankment, picked himself up unhurt, scrambled into the wood, and hid in a hollow tree, where, with branches and dead leaves, he made himself as comfortable a bed as he could, and slept soundly till the morning. The Barge. The front door of the hollow tree faced eastwards, so Toad was called at an early hour by the bright sunlight streaming in on him. He shook himself and marched forth into the comfortable morning sun. Presently the Toad came to a canal, and round a bend came plodding a solitary horse. Toad let the horse pass, and stood waiting for the barge it was pulling. With a pleasant swirl of quiet water, the barge slid up alongside him, its sole occupant a big stout woman wearing a linen sunbonnet, one brawny arm laid along the tiller.
"Nice morning, ma'am," she remarked to Toad. "Oh, I dare say it is, ma'am," responded Toad. "I dare say it is a nice morning for them that's not in sore trouble like what I am. Here's my married daughter. She sends off to me post-haste to come to her at once. So off I comes, not knowing what may be happening or going to happen, but fearing the worst, as you will understand, ma'am, if you're a mother too. And I've left my business to look after itself. I'm in the washing and laundering line, you must know, ma'am. I've lost all my money and lost me way, and as for what may be happening to my married daughter, why, I don't like to think of it, ma'am."
"Where might your married daughter be living, ma'am?" asked the barge woman.
"She lives near to the river, ma'am," replied Toad, "close to a fine house called Toad Hall."
"Toad Hall? Well, I'm going that way myself," replied the barge woman. "You come along in the barge with me, and I'll give you a lift." She steered the barge close to the bank, and Toad, with many humble and grateful acknowledgments, stepped lightly on board and sat down with great satisfaction. "Toad's luck again," thought he. "I always come out on top."
"So you're in the washing business, ma'am," said the barge woman politely as they glided along. "And a very good business you've got too, I dare say, if I'm not making too free in saying so." "Finest business in the whole country," said Toad airily. "You see, I understand my work thoroughly and attend to it all myself. Washing, ironing, clear starching, making up gents' fine shirts for evening wear, everything's done under my own eye."
"But surely you don't do all that work yourself, ma'am?" asked the barge woman respectfully.
"Oh, I have girls," said Toad lightly. 20 girls or thereabouts. But you know what girls are, ma'am. Nasty little hussies, that's what I call 'em."
"So do I too," said the barge woman with great heartiness. But I dare say you set yours to rights. And are you very fond of washing?
I love it, said Toad. I simply dote on it. Never so happy as when I've got both arms in the wash-tub.
Oh, what a bit of luck meeting you, observed the barge-woman thoughtfully. A regular piece of good fortune for both of us.
Why, what do you mean?
asked Toad nervously.
Well, look at me now, replied the barge-woman. I like washing too, just the same as you do. I've got to do all my own, naturally, moving about as I do. Now, my husband, he's such a fellow for shirking his work and leaving the barge to me, that never a moment do I get for seeing to my own affairs. By rights, he ought to be here now, instead of which he's gone off with the dog to see if they can't pick up a rabbit for dinner somewhere. But meantime, how am I to get on with my washing?
Oh, never mind about the washing,
said Toad, not liking the subject.
Try and fix your mind on that rabbit. A nice fat young rabbit, I'll be bound. Got any onions?
I can't fix my mind on anything but my washing, said the barge-woman, and I wonder you can be talking of rabbits with such a joyful prospect before you. There's a heap of things of mine in a corner of the cabin. If you'll just take one or two of the most necessary sort, I won't venture to describe them to a lady like you, but you'll recognise them at a glance, and put them through the wash-tub, you'll find a tub handy and a bucket to haul up water from the canal with. Then I shall know you're enjoying yourself, instead of sitting here idle, looking at the scenery and yawning your head off.
Here, you let me steer,
said Toad, now thoroughly frightened.
And then you can get on with your washing your own way. I might spoil things, or not do 'em as you like. I'm more used to gentlemen things myself. It's my special line.
Let you steer, replied the barge-woman, laughing. Oh, it takes some practice to steer a barge properly. Now, you shall do the washing you're so fond of, and I'll stick to the steering. Don't try and deprive me of the pleasure of giving you a treat.
Toad was fairly cornered. It was too far from the bank for a flying leap, and sullenly he resigned himself to his fate.
If it comes to that, he thought in desperation, I suppose any fool can wash.
He fetched tub, soap, and the other necessaries from the cabin, selected a few garments at random, and set to. A long half-hour passed, and every minute of it saw Toad getting crosser and crosser. He tried coaxing, he tried slapping, he tried punching. Nothing that he could do to the things seemed to please them or do them any good. His back ached badly, and he noticed with dismay that his paws were beginning to get all crinkly. Now Toad was very proud of his paws. He muttered under his breath words that should never pass the lips of either washerwomen or toads, and lost the soap for the 50th time. A burst of laughter made him straighten himself and look round. The barge-woman was leaning back and laughing unrestrainedly till the tears ran down her cheeks.
I've been watching you all the time, she gasped. I thought you must be a humbug all along from the conceited way you talked. Pretty washerwoman you are. Never washed so much as a dish-clout in your life, I'll lay.
Toad's temper, which had been simmering viciously for some time, now fairly boiled over.
You common, low-fat barge-woman, he shouted. Don't you dare talk to your betters like that. Washerwoman, indeed. I would have you to know that I am a toad, a very well-known, respected, distinguished toad. I may be under a bit of a cloud at present, but I will not be laughed at by a barge-woman.
The woman moved nearer to him and peered under his bonnet keenly and closely.
Why, so you are, she cried. Well, I never! A horrid, nasty, crawly toad, and in my nice clean barge too. Now that is a thing that I will not have.
She relinquished the tiller for a moment. One big mottled arm shot out and caught Toad by a foreleg, while the other gripped him fast by a hind leg. Then the world turned suddenly upside down, the wind whistled in his ears, and Toad found himself flying through the air. The water, when he eventually reached it with a loud splash, proved quite cold enough for his taste. He rose to the surface, spluttering, and the first thing he saw was the fat barge-woman looking back at him over the stern of the retreating barge and laughing. And he vowed, as he coughed and choked, to be even with her. Be careful, washerwoman. Toad struck out for the shore, but the cotton gown greatly impeded his efforts. and when at length he touched land, he found it hard to climb up the steep bank unassisted. He had to take a minute or two's rest to recover his breath. Then, gathering his wet skirts, he started to run after the barge as fast as his legs would carry him. The bargewoman was still laughing when he drew up level with her.
"Put yourself through your mango, washerwoman," she cried out, "and iron your face and crimp it, and you'll pass for quite a decent-looking toad."
Toad never paused to reply. He saw what he wanted ahead of him. Running swiftly on, he overtook the horse, unfastened the tow rope, and cast off, jumped on the horse's back, and urged it to a gallop by kicking it vigorously in the sides. He steered for the open country, swinging his steed down a rutty lane. The barge horse was not capable of any sustained effort, and its gallop soon subsided into a trot, and its trot into an easy walk. But Toad was quite contented with this, knowing that he, at any rate, was moving, and the barge was not. He had quite recovered his temper, now that he'd done something he thought really clever, and he was satisfied to jog along quietly in the sun. He had travelled some miles, his horse and he was feeling drowsy in the hot sunshine when the horse stopped, lowered its head, and began to nibble the grass, and Toad, waking up, just saved himself from falling off by an effort. He looked about him, and found he was on a wide common. Near him stood a dingy gypsy caravan, and beside it a man was sitting on a bucket turned upside down, very busy smoking. A fire of sticks was burning nearby, and over the fire hung an iron pot, and out of that pot came forth bubblings and gurglings, also smells, warm, rich and varied smells. So there Toad sat and sniffed and sniffed. Presently the gypsy took his pipe out of his mouth and remarked, in a careless way,
"Want to sell that there horse of yours?"
Toad was completely taken aback, but the gypsy's suggestion seemed to smooth the way towards the two things he wanted so badly, ready money and a solid breakfast.
"What?" he said. "Me sell this beautiful young horse of mine? Oh, no, it's out of the question. Besides, I'm too fond of him, and he simply dotes on me."
"Try and love a donkey," suggested the gypsy. "Some people do."
"You don't seem to see," continued Toad, "that this fine horse of mine is a cut above you altogether. No, it's not to be thought of for a moment. All the same, how much might you be disposed to offer me for this beautiful young horse of mine?"
The gypsy looked the horse over, and then he looked Toad over with equal care, and looked at the horse again.
"1 shilling a leg,"
he said briefly.
"1 shilling a leg?" cried Toad. "If you please, I must take a little time to work that out, and see just what it comes to."
He climbed down off his horse, and sat down by the gypsy, and did sums on his fingers, and at last he said,
"1 shilling a leg? Why, that comes to exactly 4 shillings and no more." "Oh, no, I could not think of accepting 4 shillings for this beautiful young horse of mine."
"Well," said the gypsy, "I'll tell you what I will do. I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's 3 6pence more than the animal's worth, and that's my last word."
Then Toad sat and pondered. At last he said firmly,
"Look here, gypsy, I tell you what we will do, and this is my last word. You shall hand me over 6 shillings and 6pence cash down, and further, you shall give me as much breakfast as I can possibly eat, at one sitting, of course, out of that iron pot of yours that keeps sending forth such delicious and exciting smells. In return, I will make over to you my spirited young horse, with all the beautiful harness and trappings that are on him, freely thrown in. If that's not good enough for you, say so, and I'll be getting on. I know a man near here who's wanted this horse of mine for years."
The gypsy grumbled frightfully, but in the end he lugged a dirty canvas bag out of the depths of his trouser pocket, and counted out 6 shillings and 6pence into Toad's paw. Then he disappeared into the caravan for an instant, and returned with a large iron plate and a knife, fork, and a spoon. He tilted up the pot, and a glorious stream of hot, rich stew gurgled into the plate. It was indeed the most beautiful stew in the world, being made of partridges and pheasants and chickens and hares and rabbits, and peahens and guinea fowls and one or two other things. Toad took the plate on his lap, almost crying, and stuffed and stuffed and stuffed, and kept asking for more, and the gypsy never grudged it him. He thought that he had never eaten so good a breakfast in all his life. When Toad had taken as much stew on board as he thought he could possibly hold, he got up and said good-bye to the gypsy, and took an affectionate farewell of the horse. The gypsy gave him directions which way to go, and he set forth on his travels again in the best possible spirits. As he tramped along gaily, he thought of his adventures and escapes, and how when things seemed at their worst, he had always managed to find a way out, and his pride and conceit began to swirl within him. "Ho, I am Toad, the handsome, the popular, the successful Toad!" He got so puffed up with conceit that he made up a song in praise of himself, and sang it at the top of his voice. It was perhaps the most conceited song that any animal ever composed. "The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all that there is to be known, but none of them know one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad." He sang as he walked, and he walked as he sang, but his pride was shortly to have a severe fall. After some miles of country lanes, he reached the high road, and as he turned into it and glanced along its white length, he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot, and then into a blob, and then into something very familiar, and a double poop-poop of warning fell on his delighted ear. "This is something like," said the excited Toad. "This is real life again. I will hail them, my brothers of the wheel, and they will give me a lift, of course, and then I will talk to them, and perhaps, with luck, it may even end in my driving up to Toad Hall in a motor car." He stepped confidently out into the road to hail the motor car, which came along at an easy pace, slowing down as it neared the lane, when suddenly he became very pale. His heart turned to water, his knees shook and yielded under him, and he doubled up and collapsed with a sickening pain in his interior. For the approaching car was the very one he had stolen out of the yard of the Red Lion Hotel on that fatal day when all his troubles began. And the people in it were the very same people he had sat and watched at luncheon in the coffee-room. The terrible motor car drew slowly nearer and nearer, till at last he heard it stop just short of him. Two gentlemen got out and walked round the trembling heap of misery lying in the road, and one of them said, "Oh dear, this is very sad. Here is a poor old thing, a washerwoman apparently, who has fainted in the road, poor creature. Let us lift her into the car and take her to the nearest village, where doubtless she has friends." They tenderly lifted Toad into the motor car and proceeded on their way. When Toad heard them talk in so kind and sympathetic a manner, he knew that he was not recognized. His courage began to revive, and he cautiously opened first one eye and then the other.
"Look,"
said one of the gentlemen.
"she's better already. How do you feel now, ma'am?"
"Oh, thank you kindly, sir,"
said Toad in a feeble voice.
"I'm feeling a great deal better."
"That's right,"
said the gentleman.
"Now keep quite still and don't try to talk."
"I won't,"
said Toad.
"I was only thinking if I might sit on the front seat there beside the driver, where I could get the fresh air full on my face."
"What a very sensible woman," said the gentleman. "Of course you shall."
So they carefully helped Toad into the front seat beside the driver. Toad was almost himself again by now. He sat up, and he turned to the driver at his side.
"Please, sir," he said, "I wish you would kindly let me try and drive the car for a little. I've been watching you carefully. It looks so easy, and I should like to be able to tell my friends that once I had driven a motor car."
The driver laughed at the proposal, so heartily that the gentleman inquired what the matter was. When he heard, he said to Toad's delight,
"Brave ma'am, I like your spirit. Let her have a try and look after her. She won't do any harm."
Toad eagerly scrambled into the seat vacated by the driver, listened with affected humility to the instructions given to him, and set the car in motion, but very slowly and carefully at first, for he was determined to be prudent. The gentlemen behind clapped their hands and applauded. Toad went a little faster, then faster still. He heard the gentleman call out warningly, "Be careful, washerwoman!" and this annoyed him, and he began to lose his head. The driver tried to interfere, but he pinned him down in his seat with one elbow and put on full speed. "Washerwoman indeed!" he shouted, recklessly. "Ho, ho! I am the Toad, the motor-car snatcher, the prison-breaker, the Toad who always escapes. Sit still, and you shall know what driving really is, for you are in the hands of the famous, the skillful, the entirely fearless Toad!" With a cry of horror, the whole party rose and flung themselves on him. "Seize him!" they cried. "Bind him, chain him, drag him to the nearest police station." Alas, they should have remembered to stop the motor-car before playing any pranks of that sort. With a half-turn of the wheel, the Toad sent the car crashing through the low hedge that ran along the roadside. Toad found himself flying through the air. Then he landed on his back with a thump in the soft, rich grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he could see the motor-car in the pond, nearly submerged. The gentleman and the driver were floundering helplessly in the water. He picked himself up rapidly and set off running across country as hard as he could, till he was breathless and weary, and had to settle down into an easy walk. When he had recovered his breath somewhat and was able to think calmly, he laughed till he had to sit down under a hedge. "Oh, ho, 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 ho!" he cried in ecstasies of self-admiration. "Toad again! Toad, as usual, comes out on the top. Who persuaded them into letting him see if he could drive? Who landed them all in a horse pond? Why, Toad, of course. Clever Toad. Great Toad. Oh, how clever I am! How clever! How very clever!" A slight noise at a distance behind him made him turn his head and look. Oh, horror! Oh, misery! Oh, despair! About 2 fields off, a chauffeur in his leather gaiters and 2 large rural policemen were visible, running towards him as hard as they could go. Poor Toad sprang to his feet and pelted away again, his heart in his mouth. "Oh, my!" he gasped as he panted along. "Oh, what an ass I am! What a conceited and heedless ass! Swaggering again! Oh, my, oh, my, oh, my!" He glanced back and saw to his dismay that they were gaining on him. On he ran desperately, but they still gained steadily. Ceasing to heed where he was going, he struggled on blindly and wildly, looking back over his shoulder at the now triumphant enemy, when suddenly the earth failed under his feet. He grasped at the air, and splash! He found himself head over heels in deep water, and he knew that in his blind panic he had run straight into the river. He rose to the surface and tried to grasp the reeds that grew along the water's edge, but the stream was so strong that it tore them out of his hands. Down he went again, and came up breathless and spluttering. Presently he saw that he was approaching a dark hole in the bank, and as the stream bore him past, he reached up with a paw and caught hold of the edge and held on. Then slowly he drew himself up out of the water, till at last he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole. There he remained for some minutes, puffing and panting. As he sighed and blew and stared before him into the dark hole, some bright small thing shone and twinkled in its depths, moving towards him. As it approached, a face grew up gradually around it, and it was a familiar face, grave and round, with neat ears and silky hair. It was the water rat. Cheer up, Toad. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, gave a great hoist and a pull, and Toad came up slowly over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hall.
"Oh, Ratty," he cried, "I've been through such times since I saw you last. You can't think. Such trials, such sufferings, and all so nobly borne. Then such escapes, such disguises, and all so cleverly planned and carried out. Been in prison, got out of it, of course. Oh, I am a smart Toad, and no mistake. What do you think my last exploit was? Just hold on till I tell you." "Toad," said the Water Rat, gravely and firmly, "you go off upstairs at once, and take off that old cotton rag and clean yourself thoroughly, and try and come down looking like a gentleman, if you can. Stop swaggering and arguing, and be off. I'll have something to say to you later." Toad was at first inclined to stop and do some talking back at him. However, he caught sight of himself in the looking-glass over the hat-stand, with the rusty black bonnet perched rakishly over one eye, and he changed his mind, and went very quickly and humbly upstairs to Rat's dressing-room. There he had a thorough wash and brush-up, and changed his clothes. By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became. When at last Toad had talked himself to a standstill, there was a silence for a while. And then the rat said, "Now, Toady, I don't want to give you pain, but don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? You know that you've never had anything but trouble from motor cars from the moment you first set eyes on one. But if you will be mixed up with them, why steal them?" Now Toad was a thoroughly good-hearted animal, and never minded being jawed by those who were his real friends. So when the rat had quite finished, he heaved a deep sigh, and said, "Quite right, Ratty. How sound you always are! Yes, I've been a conceited old ass, I can quite see that. But now I'm going to be a good Toad, and not do it any more. As for motor cars, I've not been at all so keen about them since my last ducking in that river of yours. The fact is, while I was hanging on the edge of your hole, I had a sudden idea connected with motorboats. Oh, there, don't take on so, old chap, and stamp and upset things. It was only an idea, and we won't talk about it any more. Now, we'll have our coffee and a quiet chat, and then I'm going to stroll gently down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own, and set things going again on the old lines." "Stroll gently down to Toad Hall?" cried the rat, greatly excited. "What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard?" "Heard what?" said Toad, turning rather pale. "Go on, Ratty, quick, don't spare me. What haven't I heard?" "Do you mean to tell me," shouted the rat, thumping with his little fist upon the table, "that you've heard nothing about the Stoats and Weasels, and how they've been and taken Toad Hall?" Toad leaned his elbows on the table and his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each of his eyes, overflowed and splashed on the table. Plop, plop. "Go on, Ratty," he murmured presently. "Tell me all. I can bear it." "When you got into that trouble of yours," said the rat, "animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stuck up for you, but the wild wood animals got very cocky, saying you were done for this time. You would never come back again, never, never." Toad nodded once more, keeping silence. "That's the sort of little beasts they are," the rat went on. "But Mole and Badger, they stuck out through thick and thin that you would come back again soon, somehow. So they arranged to move their things into Toad Hall and have it all ready for you when you turned up. Now I come to the most painful and tragic part of my story. One dark night, it was a very dark night, and blowing hard too, and raining simply cats and dogs, a band of Stoats and Weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage drive. The Mole and the Badger were sitting by the fire in the smoking room, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon them from every side. They made the best fight they could, but what was the good? They were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can 2 animals do against hundreds? They took and beat them severely with sticks, those 2 poor faithful creatures, and turned them out into the cold and the wet. And the Wild Wooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since, continued the Rat, eating your grub and drinking your drink and making bad jokes about you. And they're telling the tradespeople and everybody that they've come to stay for good.
Oh, have they? Said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. I'll jolly soon see about that.
It's no good, Toad, called the Rat after him. You'd better come back and sit down. You'll only get into trouble.
But the Toad was off, and there was no holding him. He marched rapidly down the road till he got near his front gate, when suddenly there popped up from behind the palings a long yellow ferret with a gun.
Who comes there?
Said the ferret sharply.
Stuff and nonsense, said Toad very angrily. What do you mean by talking like that to me? Come out of it at once, or I'll—
The ferret said never a word, but he brought his gun up to his shoulder. Toad prudently dropped flat in the road, and bang! A bullet whistled over his head. The startled Toad scrambled to his feet and scampered off down the road as hard as he could, and as he ran he heard the ferret laughing. He went back, very crestfallen, and told the Water Rat.
What did I tell you? Said the Rat. It's no good. They've got sentries posted, and they're all armed. You must just wait until we've seen the Mole and the Badger and heard their latest news and held conference and taken their advice in this difficult matter.
Yes, of course. The Mole and the Badger, said Toad lightly. What's become of them, the dear fellows? I'd forgotten all about them.
Well may you ask, said the Rat reproachfully. Those 2 poor devoted animals have been camping out in the open in every sort of weather, living very rough by day and lying very hard by night, watching over your house, contriving how to get your property back for you. You don't deserve to have such true and loyal friends, Toad. You don't really.
They just finished their supper and resumed their armchairs when there came a heavy knock at the door. Toad was nervous, but the Rat went straight up to the door, opened it, and in walked Mr. Badger. His shoes were covered with mud, and he was looking very rough and tousled, but then he never had been a very smart man, the Badger, at the best of times. He came solemnly up to Toad, shook him by the paw, and said,
Welcome home, Toad. Alas, what am I saying? Home indeed. This is a poor homecoming. Unhappy Toad.
Then he sat down to the table and helped himself to a large slice of cold pie. Presently there came another and a lighter knock, and Rat ushered in the Mole, very shabby and unwashed, with bits of hay and straw sticking in his fur.
Hooray! Here's old Toad, cried the Mole. Fancy having you back again.
And he began to dance round him.
We never dreamt you'd turn up so soon. Supposing you talk while I eat. Not a bite since breakfast. Oh, my, oh, my.
And he sat down at the table and helped himself liberally to cold beef and pickles. Afterwards they held their council of war. Whichever way they looked at it, they seemed hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned by the weasels and stoats. Then the Badger spoke.
What the Mole says is quite true. The stoats are on guard at every point, and they make the best sentinels in the world. It's quite useless to think of attacking the place. They're too strong for us.
Then it's all over, sobbed the Toad. I shall go and enlist for a soldier and never see my dear Toad Hall any more.
Come, cheer up, Toady, said the Badger. There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I haven't said my last word yet. Now, I'm going to tell you a great secret.
Toad sat up and dried his eyes.
There is an underground passage, said the Badger impressively, that leads from the river bank quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall.
Oh, nonsense, Badger, said Toad rather airily. You've been listening to some of the yarns they spin in the public houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall, inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you.
My young friend,
said the Badger with great severity.
Your father, who was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some others I know, was a particular friend of mine, and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you.
And he looked hard at the toad before continuing.
Now, there's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort whatever.
But the sentinels will be posted as usual, remarked the Rat.
Exactly, said the Badger. That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels, the stoats, and that is where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry next to the dining hall.
We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry, cried the Mole.
With our pistols and swords and sticks, shouted the Rat.
And rush in upon them, said the Badger.
And whack 'em, and whack 'em, and whack 'em, cried the Toad in ecstasy, running round and round the room and jumping over the chairs.
Very well, then, said the Badger. Our plan is settled. So, as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once. We will make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the morning tomorrow.
The attack. Toad slept till a later hour next morning. By the time he got down, he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast. The Badger sat in the armchair reading the paper, while the Mole drew his arm through Toad's and made him tell all his adventures from beginning to end, which Toad was only too willing to do. The Rat, on the other hand, was running around the room busily, with arms full of weapons of every kind, distributing them in 4 little heaps on the floor. When it began to grow dark, the Rat summoned his friends back into the parlour, stood each of them alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. First, there was a belt to go round each animal, and then a sword to be stuck into each belt, and then a cutlass on the other side to balance it. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. The Badger laughed good-humouredly and said,
All right, Ratty, it amuses you and it doesn't hurt me. I'm going to do all I've got to do with this here stick.
But the Rat only said,
Please, Badger, you know, I shouldn't like you to blame me afterwards and say I'd forgotten anything.
When all was quite ready, the Badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said,
Now then, follow me. Mole first, Rat next, Toad last.
The Toad was so anxious not to be left out that he willingly took up the inferior position assigned to him. The animals set off. The Badger led them along by the river for a little way, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the river bank, a little above the water. The Mole and the Rat followed silently. At last they were in the secret passage, and the expedition had really begun. It was cold, dark, damp, low, and narrow. Poor Toad began to shiver, partly from dread of what might be before him, partly because he was wet through. He could not help lagging behind. He heard the Rat call out warningly,
Come on, Toad!
And a terror seized him of being left behind alone in the darkness, and he came on with such a rush that he upset the Rat into the Mole and the Mole into the Badger, and for a moment all was confusion. The Badger thought they were being attacked from behind, and as there was no room to use a stick or cutlass, drew a pistol and was on the point of putting a bullet into Toad. When he found out what had really happened, he was very angry indeed, and said,
That tiresome Toad shall be left behind.
But Toad whimpered, and the other two promised that they would be answerable for his good conduct. And at last the Badger was pacified, and the procession moved on. Only this time the Rat brought up the rear with a firm grip on the shoulder of Toad. So they groped and shuffled along. Suddenly they heard, apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmurous sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor. The Toad's nervous terrors all returned, but the Badger only remarked placidly,
They are going it, the weasels.
The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them.
Hooray, 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 hooray!
They heard, and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table.
What a time they're having, said the Badger. Come on.
They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap-door that led up into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of their being overheard. The Badger said,
Now, boys, all together.
and they put their shoulders to the trap-door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall, where their enemies were carousing. The noise, as they emerged from the passage, was simply deafening. A voice could be made out saying,
Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer.
At this they heard great applause.
But before I resume my seat,
At this they heard renewed cheering.
I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad.
At this they heard great laughter.
Good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad.
And at this they heard shrieks of merriment.
Only just let me get at him,
Muttered Toad, grinding his teeth.
Hold hard a minute,
Said the Badger, restraining him with difficulty.
Get ready, all of you.
Let me sing you a little song,
Went on the voice.
which I have composed on the subject of Toad.
Now they heard prolonged applause. Then the Chief Weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice.
Toady went a-pleasuring gaily down the street.
The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced round at his comrades and cried,
The hour is come, follow me,
and flung the door open wide. My, what a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air. The terrified weasels dived under the tables and sprang madly up at the windows. The ferrets rushed wildly for the fireplace and hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Tables and chairs were upset, and glass and china sent crashing on the floor in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air. Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry.
A mole! A mole!
Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and variety. Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrow. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, grey, black, brown and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the Mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The Badger, resting from his labours, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow.
Mole,
He said,
you're the best of fellows. Just cut along outside and look after those stout sentries. I've an idea that we shan't have much trouble from them tonight.
The Mole vanished promptly through a window, and the Badger bade the other two set a table on its legs again, pick up knives and forks and plates and glasses from the debris on the floor, and see if they could find materials for a supper.
I want some grub, I do. Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich.
Toad felt rather hurt that the Badger didn't say pleasant things to him as he had to the Mole, for he was rather particularly pleased with himself, and the way he'd gone for the Chief Weasel and sent him flying across the table with one blow of his stick. But he bustled about, and so did the Rat, and soon they found a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster. They were just about to sit down when the Mole clambered in through the window, chuckling, with an armful of rifles.
It's all over,
he reported.
From what I can make out, as soon as the stoats heard the shrieks and yells and the uproar inside the hall, some of them threw down their rifles and fled. The others stood fast for a bit, but when the weasels came rushing out upon them, they thought they were betrayed, and the stoats grappled with the weasels, and the weasels fought to get away, and they wrestled and wriggled and punched each other and rolled over and over, till most of them rolled into the river. They've all disappeared by now, one way or another, and I've got their rifles, so that's all right.
Excellent and deserving animal,
said the Badger, his mouth full of chicken and trifle.
Now, there's just one more thing I want you to do, Mole, before you sit down to your supper along of us, and I wouldn't trouble you, only I know I can trust you to see a thing done. I want you to take those fellows on the floor, they're upstairs with you, and have some bedrooms cleaned out and tidied and made really comfortable. And then you can give them a licking apiece, if it's any satisfaction to you, and put them out by the back door. We shan't see any more of them, I fancy. And then come along and have some of this cold tongue. It's first rate. I'm very pleased with you, Mole.
The good-natured Mole picked up a stick, formed his prisoners up in a line on the floor, gave them the order, "Quick, march!" and led his squad off to the upper floor. After a time he appeared again smiling, and said that every room was ready and as clean as a new pin.
And I didn't have to lick them either. They were very penitent, and said they were extremely sorry for what they had done, but it was all the fault of the chief weasel and the stoats, and if ever they could do anything for us at any time to make up, we had only got to mention it. So I gave them a roll apiece, and let them out at the back, and off they ran as hard as they could.
Then the Mole pulled his chair up to the table and pitched into the cold tongue. And Toad, like the gentleman he was, put all his jealousy from him, and said heartily, "Thank you kindly, dear Mole, for all your pains and trouble." The Badger was pleased at that, and said,
"There spoke my brave Toad."
So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valour, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks.